Good morning. So I'm introducing Linda Reeder, if I can have everybody's attention. So Linda is going to be talking about Mary Colter. Linda is an architect, author, and educator. Her research on Mary E.J. Colter and the history of design and construction of the Grand Canyon has been published in the Journal of the Southwest, Construction History, and most importantly, the Old Pioneer. Great article in the Old Pioneer, by the way. She has been visiting archives and writing about Colter since receiving a Grand Canyon Historical Society grant in 2017. Linda Reeder.
Good morning. So I think most of you are familiar with Mary Colter's and many of her buildings. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about things we hear about less that Colter also contributed, the impact of her design contributions that extend well beyond the physical structures. So Colter's ability to, first I should explain this photo is a film still of Colter climbing a ladder while the Desert View Watchtower was under construction, and the structure was also created by the same company that did the Navajo Bridge that we heard about earlier. So Colter's ability to integrate buildings into their natural surroundings influenced the design of other architects and contributed to a style of architecture known as National Park Rustic, or more colloquially, parkitecture. Colter also played a role in planning and use decisions within the park, while always meeting the need of her employer, the hospitality company Fred Harvey, for new buildings to appeal to visitors. Colter sometimes added an educational component so seamlessly that it became part of their attraction. So drawing on archival material, this presentation will consider Colter's impact on park architecture, planning, and the education of Grand Canyon Park visitors about the cultures of the area's peoples, both past and present. So Mary Colter spent weeks and months at a time on the south rim of the Grand Canyon during her 40 years of working for Fred Harvey. She supervised construction, directed interior renovations, and contributed to building design and site planning in collaboration with other designers from her company, from the National Park Service, and from the Santa Fe Railway. The railway's interest in the Grand Canyon was in increasing its share of transcontinental passenger traffic by promoting the Grand Canyon as an excursion, and you can see some of their advertisements here. Fred Harvey's role in the Santa Fe Railway's success was essential to its business. The company had also built its reputation on quality, so Colter's design work had to provide a high-quality visitor experience that attracted and served guests. Educating visitors about the Grand Canyon was not a requirement for the designer, but Colter often integrated what she once called authentic and therefore interesting features that both charmed and educated travelers. One example is the geologic fireplace, which you see here, which he designed in 1935 for the lounge of the Bright Angel Lodge. It exhibits rocks from different strata of the canyon and was inspired by the geological column that park naturalist Edwin McKee had constructed on the porch of the Yavapai Museum a few years earlier, and you can see that on the right. To achieve scientific accuracy in the fireplace, Colter relied on McKee. She wrote him, "I know the design I want, but I depend entirely on you for the geology." While always guided by authenticity and generating interest, Colter more typically integrated educational elements that fell within her expertise, like features related to the peoples who predated the tourists at the Grand Canyon. When Santa Fe Railway architect W.H. Moore proposed a Swiss chateau-style building, similar to the El Tovar style, for the site that's now occupied by the Bright Angel Lodge, Colter did not approve. Instead, she designed the site-specific lodge and cabins that recalled the region's recent history. And she also, instead of aligning them in a grid, like had happened with a lot of auto camps and other structures. She did it more like as if they had grown there, been built naturally over a period of time. And when the complex opened, a local newspaper described the Bright Angel Lodge and cabins like this. The building rambles, oh, I should change the slide, sorry. The building rambles good-naturedly with the land and resembles nothing more than an old pioneer village, depicting first the early pioneer who used rocks nearest at hand, then the Mexican who employed logs plastered with mud, and finally the railroad days when yellow knotted pine boards were used with a rock foundation. Here, then, in one rambling lodge, are buildings placed carefully together, yet representing periods 50 years apart. Colter also elected to preserve and remodel two 19th century buildings that were on the Bright Angel site. And historic preservation was not a concern in the US at that time. It wasn't really on the radar, so her decision to do this was not an obvious one. Colter's restoration and adaptive reuse of the old post office, which was originally the Red Stage Horse Station and is shown on the left, preserved an example of hand-squared log construction. By incorporating the notched log Bucky O'Neill cabin on the right into a lodge building, Colter preserved the home of an early settler and another authentic piece of 1890s Grand Canyon history. Colter's most overt effort to educate visitors through building design is seen in the Desert View Watchtower, completed in 1932. Colter created interest in and a connection to the ancient peoples of the region by adapting and combining architectural features from ancestral Puebloan sites in the Four Corners region into the Watchtower's design. She decorated interior surfaces with reproductions of ancient petroglyphs to continue this education about the past. Importantly, she also commissioned Hopi artist Fred Cabote to paint murals on the walls and ceilings of the Watchtower's second floor. And in this way, she reminded visitors of the continuity of Puebloan culture in the Grand Canyon region. To make sure tourists understood the architectural influences for the Watchtower's design, Colter compiled 4 albums of annotated photographs collected during her 6 months of research visits to ancestral Puebloan sites when she was preparing to design the Watchtower. And these were available for the visitors to examine in the Watchtower's lounge. They aren't anymore. She also wrote an 83-page manual for Fred Harvey tour leaders explaining the relationship between the real ruins and the Watchtower at Desert View. The manual also provided information on the wall painting's significance to the Hopi people. Since the park's founding, Colter's work and design aesthetic resulted in her playing a role as a trusted advisor for National Park Service designers. Her ability to harmonize her buildings with the landscape, like you see here at Phantom Ranch, and her references to indigenous structures influenced the design of other structures at both the Grand Canyon and at other parks. When first the Grand Canyon National Monument and later the National Park were formed, the agencies newly responsible for administering the area inherited buildings that were already constructed there. Overall, at the Grand Canyon, the agencies were pleased with what they found. The South Rims Village was dominated by tourist developments owned by the Santa Fe Railway and operated by Colter's employer, Fred Harvey. The Santa Fe Railway favored the creation of a national park at Grand Canyon. Promoting travel there was important to the railway, and therefore it was important to Fred Harvey. The selection of Colter to represent the two companies' interests in meetings with officials of the U.S. Forest Service and later the National Park Service demonstrates the confidence they had in her abilities. This confidence was soon shared by the administrators of the Grand Canyon's federal lands. In 1916, the authors of the U.S. Forest Service's working plan wrote, "As long as the company's work is passed upon by Ms. Colter, its present architect, its appropriateness can be considered assured." In January 1919, Park Service landscape architect Charles Punchard has a series of conferences with Colter to learn about Fred Harvey's plans so as to prioritize what work to fund. Punchard reported finding a certain degree of refinement and success in the design and location of structures already on the ground. The character of the building that was done under the direction of the railroad company and the Fred Harvey Company was interesting and commendable. Among the Grand Canyon buildings these men admired were two rest houses, rimside rest houses and observatories constructed by the Santa Fe Railway in 1914. The U.S. Forest Service's 1916 working plan reported that the lookout was designed and constructed under the supervision of Miss Mary E.J. Colter of the Fred Harvey concern. It is of stone and seems a part of the rim itself. The same Forest Service document reports that Hermit's Rest, which you see here, was designed by Ms. Colter and constructed under her supervision. Its effect is admirable. In her 1914 designs for the Lookout and Hermit's Rest, including the rustic native materials to use and the structure's integration with their sites, Colter anticipated the design priorities of the National Park Service. The Park Service was created in 1916 with the competing missions to both leave parklands unimpaired and also to provide the means for the public to enjoy the sites, which usually means impairing the parklands. After the Grand Canyon was formed in 1919, the Park Service needed a number of new buildings to meet their needs here, and the buildings needed to be subservient to nature. Punchard and his successor Daniel Hull worked closely with Colter. An analysis reads that the landscape architects emulated Colter's architectural themes with regard to the use of wood and stone materials and the bold siting of structures. And this influence can be seen in Hull's design for the park's first administration building, which was constructed in 1921 and is pictured here. So when the Park Service, when the Grand Canyon became a park, in addition to needing a lot more structures, they also wanted a comprehensive plan to kind of show the way for how the park should be developed. And it was a priority. So in 1922, Superintendent Crosby called the Santa Fe's securing of the services of a Chicago architecture firm to help with the comprehensive plan, that this step was of inestimable importance. But in addition to the architecture firm, representatives from the Santa Fe Railway, Fred Harvey, and the Park Service also participated in developing this plan. Colter was a valuable member of the team. Hull, the Park Service's landscape architect, spent 2 weeks at the Grand Canyon in 1923 working with Colter on the plan for the Park Service developments that were compatible with the railway's existing buildings. Adopted in 1924, the comprehensive plan designated locations for 4 zones of activities, reserving the canyon's rim for public use. Many concepts in the plan were largely followed for the next 3 decades or more, and some of them are still followed. And Colter remained, after this planning task, Colter remained a trusted advisor to the Park Service for planning issues throughout her time with Fred Harvey. And some of the issues that arose were like, there's a lot more cars now. And so she was often consulted, for example, at Hermit's Rest and at the Watchtower for changes to the site and to building access that would accommodate the increase in visitors and in cars. Although the 1924 comprehensive plan identified a museum as a high priority for the village, the first permanent museum was developed 2 miles away in 1928. The Yavapai Point Trailside Museum was designed by Herbert Mayer. Colter was not involved with the design for this museum, but her rimside buildings influenced the design for this material in terms of Mayer's choice of materials and the building's integration with the landscape. An analysis of the museum's historic significance reads, Herbert Mayer admired Mary Colter and had a special interest in her ability to position buildings on the edge of natural canyons and to successfully blend native stone buildings with natural rock formations. Mayor's respect for Colter's work and anthropological interest in the indigenous architecture of the southwestern Native Americans is evidence in his design of Yavapai. Hull's administration building, also influenced by Colter's work, was admired by the public, so much so that the park superintendent wrote to Fred Harvey and asked if they would produce postcards of it because people kept coming in and asking for them. But when the new administration building opened in 1929, the future of the old administration became uncertain. But Colter came to the rescue, solving two problems with one neat solution. At the conclusion of a long-anticipated conference held to determine locations for future Fred Harvey developments and for a residence for the park superintendent, Colter recommended that the old administration building be converted into a superintendent's residence, and her idea was approved in March 1931 by the Department of Interior's director. The architects and landscape architects who Colter influenced went on to influence others, both through their design work, their speaking, and their writing that documented the philosophies that Colter had influenced. Thomas Vint, who succeeded Daniel Hull as the Park Service's chief landscape engineer, appreciated Colter's use of indigenous themes in her architecture. In 1929, he asked Colter for copies of the photographs she had taken at Mesa Verde of cave dwellings and other structures, photos that had influenced Colter's work at the Grand Canyon. In 1930, Vint's article, Landscape Development in Our National Parks, was published in The Western Architect, a journal for design professionals. In it, Vint suggested that designers allow nature to dominate and avoid the monumental and stylistic and think of something native and retiring, both in design and choice of materials. He suggested the use of native materials such as those Colter employed at her Grand Canyon structures. In 1935, Herbert Mayer, whose design of the Yavapai Point Museum had been influenced by Colter's work at the Grand Canyon, gave a speech to state park officials about selecting sites and harmonizing the buildings with the sites. His talk included many of the strategies that Colter employed at the Grand Canyon, including sensitive siting of structures, using native materials, adapting indigenous or pioneer methods of construction, and creating low structures with horizontal lines. Many of the ideas Mayer presented at the conference were later included in Albert H. Good's 1938 book about park structures, a book widely considered to embody the National Park Service's design principles. Through her design of her own buildings and the influence of her design ethos on other architects and landscape architects, Colter contributed to a style of architecture that came to be known as National Park Service Rustic. National Park Service historical architect Merrill Ann Wilson wrote of the style, "Perhaps for the first time in the history of American architecture, a building became an accessory to nature." National Park Service Rustic was employed as an architectural style in the park system from the Park Service's founding until 1942. So through her design work, Colter influenced the design of structures in Grand Canyon National Park and in other buildings for decades. She did this through the integration of her building designs with their natural settings. By incorporating authentic elements of Grand Canyon history into her buildings, Colter educated, and is still educating, generations of park visitors about the history and peoples who have inhabited the region for centuries. Less well known is her role as a trusted advisor to the Park Service, contributing to park planning at a wide range of sites and scales. Colter's legacy in design at the Grand Canyon is both broad and deep. So if you want to read more, in fall 1921, I wrote an article in the Old Pioneer about the buildings, which I didn't really talk about today. So if you're interested in that, you can go back and read that. And I also have a free monthly newsletter about women architecture and the history of America. And each month I have a feature on Mary Colter. So please feel free to sign up for that if you're interested. Thank you.